Hello. Welcome, everybody. For any of the stragglers, please just come in and grab a seat. Everybody got so quiet so quickly. All right, well, thank you all for coming to this amazing NeuroPanel event. I kind of want to start things off by welcoming all of you and giving a huge thanks to the Dana Foundation, who's sponsoring this event, as well as our partner BrainMind and our co-host, the MIT Press. My name is Alex Higuera, and I'm the lead organizer at NeuroTechX Boston, which is the Boston chapter of NeuroTechX, which is an international community of almost 20,000 neurotech enthusiasts. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Adam Seffler. Like I mentioned, he is the CEO of NeuroTechX Services. And thank you all for joining.
Thank you, Alex. I'll be very quick. So yes, I'm part of NTX Services, but I'm also a board member of NeuroTechX. And what is great today is to think about how the topic of ethics have evolved throughout the years. So back in 2015, 16, 17, it was a casual conversation across a genuine event, people meeting up. And if we think about where we are today, there's an event like the one we have actual initiatives, we're talking about it, we've published chapters of books about this, and we're also working on a neurotech micro-credential, so the first program about neurotech with Queen's University. So thank you, Susan, for being here, Susan is our partner in crime on the Queen's side, and there's a whole course dedicated to neuroethics. So I just wanted to frame today's event in a much broader context where the neurotechnology industry is evolving quite a bit, and ethics is really becoming, an integral part of every conversation. And the reason why we chose to have a course about it is that as much as people need to understand about neuromodulation, neurofeedback, and so on, they should also think about neuroethics as being a foundation of neurotechnology. So with that in mind, Bob Pryor from MIT Press will say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Good evening. I'm Bob Pryor for the MIT Press. We're one of the sponsors this evening. MIT Press is 60 years old. We just celebrated our 60th anniversary. And in 1962, when we were founded, one of the first books we published was in neuroscience. So our roots with the field of neuroscience run very, very deep. We are also very heavily involved in publishing of neuroethics. I have to look at my notes. Martha Farah's book on neuroethics was published in 2010. That was probably the first book on neuroethics. And we have several others coming on bioethics in brains, and another by Walter Glannon at the University of Calgary, which is going to be a textbook on neuroethics. So this is an important area for us, and we are very privileged to be part of this community. And I hope very much you enjoy this evening's event. And now I introduce Diana Seville from BrainMind.
All right, that's a lot of introductions. I'm going to keep this very short. I'm Diana Seville, co-founder and COO of BrainMind. And we are a nonprofit organization, and we ask this question: what neurotechnology would you create if you could take profit entirely out of the equation and only think about benefit to humanity? So we bring together funders, researchers, entrepreneurs around that question, and we bring resources into that space. But you cannot talk about impact, the effect of neurotechnology on the future of humanity, without ethics, without a strong ethical framework. And that's what brought us to neuroethics. And we were really excited to find that very smart people for multiple decades have been thinking about this topic. And actually 20 high-level guidelines have been published nationally and internationally to address these questions. So we have some answers, but still many open questions about what right and wrong when it comes to neurotechnology. So we have this incredible panel here to discuss the organ that is really from which derives our sense of being human. And when we're talking about modulating and sensing and decoding that organ, there are major societal and ethical questions that emerge. So without further ado, I ask you to lend your precious brains for the next 90 minutes to Anna Wexler. Please come up, our facilitator for the evening. She is, sure, round of applause. Anna is faculty at UPenn and the director of the Wexler Lab. Next, we have Dr. Rachel Conrad. Welcome. Rachel is faculty at Harvard Medical School. She teaches neuroethics to undergraduates at Harvard, and she is the director of youth mental health at Brigham and Women's Hospital. Welcome. Then we have Adam Molnar, who's the co-founder and head of partnerships at Neurable, a BCI company. And pardon the chairs. And finally, we have Ben Stetcher, who is a patient advocate and head of the patient advisory board for Rune Labs, a brain data company. And we are also joined by Anna Mikas. Anna, thank you for staying up late in Barcelona to join us. Her flight was canceled, but she is making it work. Anna is the CEO of Neuroelectrics, which provides EEG solutions to labs all over the world. And she's going to also be speaking from the entrepreneur perspective. So thank you all for joining.
Great, thanks everybody. We really have a fantastic panel for you here today. As Diana said, my name's Anna Wexler. I'm a professor of medical ethics and health policy at the University of Pennsylvania. I study ethical, legal, and social issues surrounding neurotechnology. And I wanted to kick things off by asking each of the panelists to give a bit, more of an in-depth introduction. So if you could introduce yourself and just talk a bit briefly about your experience related to neurotechnology.
My name is Rachel Conrad, and I am a child and adolescent psychiatrist, and I continue to practice psychiatry, and I'm also trained in bioethics at Harvard Medical School. And right now I'm really spending a lot of my time teaching. And so I'm teaching from freshman year of undergraduates to fifth year residents and fellows in medical training. It's really interesting to work with students at such different levels of their training and experiences and personal growth. But I think what brings the ethics of, or the experience of good ethics education is teaching people to sit with things that are uncomfortable and teaching them to have conversations that they otherwise avoid, particularly with the physicians, drawing out topics that no one wants to talk about in the hospital. And I think ethics begins when everyone's uncomfortable and no one knows what the answer is. And so that's really what we work on in the ethics curriculum at Harvard.
Hi everyone, I'm Adam. I helped co-found a company called Neurable about 7 years ago, and I work primarily on the business side, and in doing so I interface with so many different types of organizations that I realized early on that getting ahead of some of these concepts is really critical to a technology that's going to change everything. So yeah, I've been talking about this for a little while now, and I've been in a unique position where I've been at the crossroads of, I think, very important ethical decisions, at least on a small scale, that permeate to greater ramifications, and excited to speak with these lovely people here today.
All right, thank you, Adam. Hi, everybody, my name is Benjamin Stetcher. I'm from Toronto, Canada, by way of Nairobi, Kenya, but Israel and Denmark and a bunch of other places in between as well. So I'm here today because my foot is shaking, kind of. I was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease about 10 years ago, but last year I actually underwent a pretty radical kind of new treatment for this particular disease. It's called deep brain stimulation therapy. It's been done about 200,000 times all around the world, but what was unique about mine was that mine is actually an adaptive system as well. And what I'm going to do, maybe, I don't know if now is a good time.
Sure.
Okay. So now I'm actually going to be demonstrating to you what exactly that looks like here. So, Adam. So, thank you. This is a Samsung programmer for Medtronic. If you look on the screen above you, you'll see that was me about 1 year ago today. Or the first one was June 1st of last year. That lovely looking cap that I had on my skull was a frame that got bolted into a much larger contraption that then held me in place as the deep brain stimulator was implanted within me. The next picture that you see was 3 days later in the hospital after the battery was inserted in my chest and the wires were tunneled through my neck. If you go to the next picture though, So that was during this operation itself. Yeah, if anyone is, maybe I should have said this before, but if anyone is squeamish, they might want to look away right now. Too late though, I'm sorry. But in that picture, the holes are being drilled through the tops of my head. And I was awake for that entire surgery as well. It was about an 8-hour procedure. And this is basically the result of that. Now, before I show you this next thing, please go to the next slide. And I want to show you what it sounds like inside your own So what do you think that was? Any guesses as to what that sound might have been? Well, obviously it's a part of my brain. But which part of, actually it's more or less what your brain sounds like as well, if you go deep, deep, deep inside of it. Any idea what that structure is called though? It's the most common structure that DBS is implanted in people with Parkinson's disease. Very good.
It's up there.
So yes, that was the subthalamic nucleus, and that's more or less what yours sounds like as well. Now, I don't know about you guys, but to me that sounds like 10,000 dolphins all chattering all at once very quickly. If we can play one more time while I set up this next thing, and please zoom in on this if you have a minute. Thank you. All right, now what's happening is, I don't know if you can see this right now. Yeah, good, okay. All right, so the communication is in progress. So what's happening is that there's a message going from here to this transponder thing, to the battery, to the wires, and then back out again. And what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna show you what the 3 things that is really unique about, or kind of unique about this thing. So first there's the adaptive setting, which is currently on right now. I'm gonna turn this off momentarily. A couple things I need to say first. Well, actually I'm gonna hold off on some of these things for now. But first I just want to let you guys know that I'm just gonna pause the adaptive therapy, and you'll see a slight change within me as it reverts back to the continuous DBS settings. Come on. It's loading something. There we go. All right. So now in an instant, and I don't know how much you guys were able to perceive, to be honest, but I feel it pretty instantaneously as my tremor tends to get a little bit worse. But there's also a bunch of things happening within me as well that are somewhat imperceptible to you guys, because you guys don't know what it's like to be in my brain, obviously. I'm gonna turn this back on now, but then what I'm gonna do next is gonna be a little bit more dramatic as well. Hold on.
And was it totally off just now?
No.
It's on continuous.
So that was just the continuous settings as well. However, I have a bone to pick also with Medtronic. I hope there's no Medtronic reps here right now. But I don't know if anybody could just see, but there's 2 words written, left and right. What do you think left and right actually means, though? So neither me nor my doctors really knew at the beginning, because the right side of your brain controls the left side of your body, and vice versa. It was not properly labeled on this lovely little Samsung thing, and so yeah. But now it's going to be a little bit more dramatic, and for some people it might be a little bit uncomfortable to see this next part. I'm going to turn off the whole device, and you'll see what the whole effect of DBS is like, and then I'll turn it back on as well. A couple things to note, though, is that I might not be able to speak properly during it. I'll continue to talk. I'll try to talk as much as I can. But you'll see how my ability to speak will be limited in those times as well. But yeah, without further ado, let me just turn this baby off. Okay. Oh, yeah. Can you zoom in so I can see it? Come on. All right. So now what's happening is in an instant, the electricity from the battery was turned off. Some of the most difficult parts for me is something called dystonia. Does anybody know what dystonia is? It's like it's when your muscles become very, very tense. And again, this happens pretty instantaneously. because of this wonderful little DBS device that I have implanted inside of me. So it's something that you can't see in my foot. In particular, it's a little bit painful even sometimes because it's curled up like even this. It's hard for me to actually let go of the grip on this transponder even. Anyways, I'm going to turn this back on, and hopefully this will turn itself back on as well. Come on. Communication in progress. Hold on. Still, okay. Okay, so I feel it instantaneously, but usually it takes a few minutes for the effect to then wash through my whole body. I'm going to stop talking for now, though, and hand it back over to our moderator over there.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you for for your willingness to share that with us, and I think that's a very moving and very strong demonstration of the power of neurotechnology. I mean, right before our eyes here. Anna, it's a bit hard to follow this for your intro, but you do incredible things as well. Would you give us a brief intro and talk a little bit about your work in neurotech? You're on. Oh.
But right now, what I'm wearing now, it's a non-invasive, not only EEG, but a sort of neuromodulation, right? So NeuroTechX has developed this technology, which is an EEG, but also a non-invasive electrical stimulation. So of course, we cannot get to profound areas of the brain, but we still think we can modulate brain activity in cortical areas and help millions of patients that are in need. So as a CEO and founder of this company that is in clinical trials with the FDA on epilepsy and depression, the first time I met a neuroethicist, I was so shocked in terms of the questions they were asking. I never thought of them in my technology development. So I became, as an entrepreneur, super interested in questions that neither the FDA, neither all the quality measures as a medical device manufacturer, nobody was asking me. So I think that knowing Anna and so many people on the field made me really rethink the way we are developing this new therapy for patients at NeuroTechX. And I often think of issues of identity, autonomy, and privacy in ways I would never have thought if I wasn't exposed to this world. So I think that this event today is amazing. I'm sorry I cannot be there. I'll be there tomorrow. But I think it's great that the audience out there at MIT, the researchers and the people that are developing these technologies are aware of these challenges, and that we are dealing with the most sophisticated yet more unknown part of our body and what defines us as humans, right? So I think that in the debate we can think of whether these should be neuro rights, as Rafa Yuste and colleagues at Columbia are pushing. These should be regulated, so me as a company should have stronger regulation, or these should be more of guidelines, right, by the industry. So I just leave a few items there for the discussion, but I'm always very happy to join neuroethics, and I honestly embed them in my day-to-day work as a CEO.
Thank you, and that's actually a great segue to our next question for the panel, because we're not just here to talk about neurotech, we're here to talk about ethics and neurotech. So this is a question for all the panelists. What do you think are the main ethical issues in neurotech? And I know there's many, and I know we can spend many hours thinking about them. But if you had to pick your top one or two things that for you are the most pressing, what would those be? And a related question, if you want to touch upon it, is do you think that these issues are unique to neurotech, or are they issues sort of that we want to think about generally with other sorts of technology? And we could just go around. So Rachel can kick things off.
So one thing that I think about a lot in my clinical work with psychiatry and as well as in the neuroethics course that I teach is what is a human's identity, and what kind of aligned with that, when are they responsible for their behavior? And so I think that a really pragmatic example of this is if someone has a computer-brain interface, some type of technology in their brain, and they commit a crime when they have that computer in their brain. How do we know if that person is responsible for that crime, or is the person who programmed that computer responsible for the crime, or is no one responsible for the crime? We don't have legal precedents for any of these things. And further, ethics is actually not necessarily always aligned with the law, and as Anna mentioned, regulatory bodies and legal precedents follows far behind novel technologies. And so that's something that I think about a lot, like where does human identity end and where does something else begin, and when are people responsible for their actions, and who is making those decisions once we have computers so closely aligned with our minds.
Hi, everyone. I had a really interesting meeting early on in my career where I met a woman from Europe. She's part of the largest think tank there. It's a German name. I wouldn't dare try to pronounce it. It's like 20 characters. And she was working on data ethics. And she had reached out to me, seeing that I was part of a neurotechnology company. And I thought it was really interesting that she reached out. And she and I had a long conversation about the implications of the technology, implications of security and ethics in general. And one of the, I guess, conclusions that I came to in that conversation was that a lot of the issues of potential neurotechnology are very similar challenges to data. I think data ethics is the same, if not the bigger umbrella that neuroethics falls under. And one of the challenges that we face as a field is somewhat of a semantic argument of this versus that. And so I think, from my perspective, being able to educate end users or future end users about what is brain data, why is it important, how do you understand it, what are the implications, getting that kind of literacy out there, in my opinion, is one of the most important things that we can do, especially because even if you just look at your smartphone data, most people truly don't understand the extent to it goes. Actually, if you look in the news, just today, TikTok is under supreme hot water because it's been found that it's funneling a whole ton of information to China, that a lot of the data that we thought was private is actually not. And what is it, the FCA? One of those associations was like, we need to remove TikTok today. So yeah, so that's my unpopular opinion, that neuroethics really is just data ethics, and that data literacy is one of the most important things that we can do as academics, as entrepreneurs, et cetera.
So there's a lot of different things that we should be talking about, a lot of different things that could be talked about as well. Two things that my fellow panelists just mentioned as well are very important as well. But for me, honestly, as a patient, this isn't very much related to the brain per se, but I think it is the informed consent as well. At the beginning of every clinical trial, there's an informed consent sheet that every patient has to sign. And you're very much bound to what's in there for the duration of that trial. However, it's basically just a piece of paper that I signed over a year ago. I have no idea today what is in that piece of paper or that document. And so I think that informed consent should be a process of educating patients. They should have regular, I don't know if testing is the right solution, but it should be a process whereby I am continually reminded about what's in that informed consent document, and then I'm always re-educated about that as well. Because I have no idea what's in there, and yet I'm completely legally bound by basically everything that's written in that document. And I'm expected to know it as well, even though I don't know it. I consider myself a fairly well-educated patient, but I don't remember what I signed over a year ago. So yeah, it'd be that informed consent document should be part of this discussion as well.
Anna?
Yeah, I hear your pain as a patient, because our 190 patients in our pivotal phase 3 study, we are also doing the informed consent. And I totally agree. I mean, even our first indication is epilepsy, and this is non-invasive brain stimulation, is pretty new. So there is a huge education to do, not only on the patient, but also on the neurologist, or, in the case of depression, on the psychiatrist. So it's a relatively new technique, right? And it's not neurosurgeons like DBS that are applying this technology, but it's really neurologists or psychiatrists. So I really feel your pain, and I think that sponsors and in general companies, we should make a bigger effort to constantly educate the patient and the physicians. But with Adam, I understand the data issue, but to me, I am more concerned, right? Because for the EEG side of the technology, for the reading of the brain, I agree that data is huge, but for brain stimulation, for neuromodulation, there's still a lot of open questions. When an entrepreneur from the Silicon Valley comes to me and says, Anna, I want to do a similar technology like yours in the consumer space, I often ask them, do we understand the long-term effects of stimulating the brain constantly, day after day after day, on a consumer space? And the answer is we don't know, right? We don't know the long-term effects, right? So that's kind of like an open question that I think should be further analyzed. And the other is judgment. I understand the data privacy, but when we are stimulating the brain of a healthy person or a patient, are we changing their judgment, for example? So I think that's why neurotech, and especially brain stimulation, it's so unique in terms of ethics. I think it's another dimension that general data or artificial intelligence in terms of ethics.
Ready for some arguments?
Sure. Why don't you can respond, and then I want to pick up on the patient engagement point.
For sure. Anna, do you use any form of social media? LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook? I'm friends with you on LinkedIn. I know you have one.
Yes, I do.
So
I do, Adam. I do.
I would argue that all of those are things that are neurally stimulating and have an effect on our personality. And that's why I say it's a battle of semantics when we're talking about neuroethics versus data ethics. It's a lot of the similar problem, just couched in different charged emotional feeling or I think that people put brains on the pedestal almost to some extent. But yeah, in my opinion, that there are so many things that are administered to us in our environment on a daily basis that are intentionally trying to change our neurochemical processes, et cetera, so that neuroethics really is data ethics at the end of the day. But yeah, I'll throw it back to one of you. And Anna.
I'll leave it to any of the panelists if they want to jump in.
So I think that actually we can tie all of these pieces in with like patient consent, change in behavior, and what kind of closed loop technologies mean. So for example, if someone says like, they're developing some kind of neuropsychiatric illness, and they say like in their kind of living will, saying their future medical wishes, if Anna develops a technology that's gonna cure my disease, please give it to me. So a decade later, they're totally demented, bedridden, haven't spoken for years, and Anna's new technology is approved. And so they have their pre-stated wishes that this person wants this technology. And so you put Anna's fancy cap on, and the patient wakes up after a decade. And then they decide that they don't want that treatment anymore. So who is the patient? Is the patient the person a decade before who made this planning for what they would want when they developed a neurodegenerative disease? Is the patient the person who's unable to speak and lying in a bed? Or is the patient the one who's now wearing the cap and has arisen from the dead? And so then it becomes questions of identity. Who's responsible for behavior and who's allowed to make decisions?
Yeah, in my opinion, I think that if you're a patient that's signing away that right, you should be educated to everyone's point so far as to what are the potential implications. Are you signing away that in 10 years you may wake up and you may have a different response? Which direction are you going to go? And obviously some of these things are not possible to discern. Like I think an actual very real challenge with neuroethics is that there are so many unknowns. The unknowns that happen from the unknown policies, applications, capabilities that are about to be put out there. So it's interesting.
So I'll just tie this back to some of the debate that goes on in neuroethics, which is, I think, something that all the panelists were sort of hinting at, which was whether there's something unique about the brain, right? And so in neuroethics or philosophy, we often call it neuroexceptionalism, right? Is there something unique here? Should we be treating the brain differently when we think about ethics than when we think about ethics of pharmaceutical drugs, or ethics of cardiology or psychiatry. Well, psychiatry gets to the brain, but so I think that's one main question, and I would say there's no answer, right? As you could see here, this was a great example of debates in either way, right? Adam's saying these are the same issues that we have in other areas. This is just, I think, if I understand you correctly, right, that this is a different instantiation, really, of issues that we talk about more broadly in other fields, like data ethics, right? And there are those like, who I think, Anna, you'd probably fall along this line, and Rachel, right, who think that, right, there is something fundamentally different here about the brain. Where I do think we all agree is that these issues are really important to talk about, right? I would say that, and that I think we can learn from the fields that have explored and grappled with similar problems. So I hope I hope I portrayed people's comments accurately. But I want to move to a point that Ben, you picked up on, and that I think your perspective is really powerful here, and that's with regards to patient engagement, especially in trials, right? So you're in an experimental trial right now. And there's been a lot of discussion recently from the National Institutes of Health and in the neuroethics literature about really the lack of patient engagement and the lack of adequate patient education when it comes to trials, especially of implantable devices, right? It's not like you're taking a drug and you stop taking the drug and you don't have the drug in your body, right? There's an implant that's in your body, perhaps permanently, right? And so, so it raises a really different set of questions, right? And so I know you serve on a patient advisory board, and you've been really a patient advocate. And so I wondered if you could share with us from your experience, so you mentioned one about informed consent. What are other things that you see are the main issues in this space? What are things that you would like to, if you could speak to developers of neurotechnology, what would you tell them are points they should be considering about patient engagement and the patient perspective?
Okay. So first off, I'm currently building a patient advisory board for this company called Rune Labs. It's going to be the 5th one that I've helped to create. 2 were for 2 giant pharmaceutical companies, and 2 were for 2 clinics up in Canada.
That's amazing that you've done all that.
However, the reason why I'm doing everything that I'm doing, and I also have a website called tomorrowedition.com, just some free plug for me, I guess. But the reason why I'm doing everything that I'm doing is because I noticed very early on in the course of my disease all the gaps that were there. And I think it actually stems and starts a lot from the researchers and the academics, because they write for other academics and for other researchers. And yet, they also are responsible for creating a body of knowledge about Parkinson's or whatever condition might be out there. And yet they only speak to one another, really. I mean, they're only really talking in their papers to each other, and they only really care about the recognition of their peers and their colleagues. And I saw that as a huge problem early on, because as I looked for information about Parkinson's disease, and you get through the first few pages, and then you suddenly see that you're in this minefield of this academic jargon. And it took me a long time to navigate it. It took me a long time to understand what was going on inside of me. And to be honest, I don't think anybody still really understands this particular disease very well. So I created this resource, Tomorrow Edition, in kind of a hope or an effort to try and make some of this language a little bit more digestible to regular individuals who might not be academics or who don't have that research background. However, I would love it if researchers the world over, and I'm sure there's some here, at the beginning of every paper that you submit to every journal, if you just write 2 or 3 sentences at the top for the lay audience. And you should start with that as well. I think not only would your paper be far more impactful that way, but you'd be able to communicate what you're trying to do to the world, and in a language that they would understand. I think it's very important that you speak to a general audience when you're creating a body of knowledge, creating any kind of knowledge, really. You have to speak to regular, everyday people who are not in your field. So that would be my next request, I guess. I have a lot of them, though, so stay tuned.
So Rachel, I was wondering if, your perspective, as a physician, both a physician and as an ethicist, right? What do you think physicians don't know? Physicians and physician researchers, right? What do you think physicians don't know that they should know, in terms of thinking about ethics in this space and thinking about patient engagement considerations?
Yeah, I would say I'm kind of overall pretty alarmed of the lack of ethics, medical ethics and neuroethics education across medicine. It's very recently become, I guess this answers your question. It's only very recently become a training requirement that physicians are trained in any sort of ethics. And there's no specifics of what that constitutes at any level of education. And so, we're actually trying to do a publication right now on the ethics curriculum at Harvard, and just trying to find citations of other similar programs in the country. We were just emailing all of our contacts, and basically we really can't find very many ethics training programs at medical schools in the entire United States. So I would say that there's enormous gaps, and I think that there's cultural problems in the field of medicine. There's something that's often called the hidden curriculum, about kind of assimilating and submitting to the dominant medical culture and not questioning things. And so a lot of what I do, I teach medical ethics to the first-year medical students and to the fourth-year medical students. And the first year, they're delightful. They're so enthusiastic and warm and open and human. And when we talk about something, they talk about their grandparents and they cry, when we talk about end of life or difficult medical decision making. And then the fourth year, they're very shut down because they've been exposed to all these distressing situations in the hospital and told that they can't talk about it and they can't feel about it and to go see the next patient. And so we think about it as kind of trying to bring back out their distress, trying to help them get in contact with those feelings and recognize that they should be upset by the things they're seeing. And so, but it's really hard to hold that level of nuance and complexity with the intense demands, sleep deprivation, patient volumes, and rapidly changing technologies to actually create space to think and feel about the complexity of these decisions.
I want to move to two questions for the entrepreneurs on our panel, Adam and Anna. So shifting gears just a little bit here. So both of you have co-founded neurotech companies, and I know that from talking to both of you, that both of you really think carefully about ethics and neuroethics. So I have a two-part question here. One is, have you encountered practical challenges when trying to incorporate ethics or ethical thinking into the work that your day-to-day work at the companies that you run? And then a second, broader question that actually, I should say that these questions, I culled them from some of the audience. I know you guys all submitted questions beforehand, so some of these are, and actually many of you had this next question, which is, do you think that the goals of ethics are fundamentally at odds with the goals of the companies that are more profit-driven, and you have certain responsibilities, to your investors and your shareholders? So a two-part question. One is really about practical challenges, and the second is, about this potential tension, let's say, between ethics and business. Let's actually switch things up. So Anna, why don't you start?
I was just going to say Anna.
Yeah, you go ahead, Anna, first.
Thank you, Adam. So I think it's interesting. When I first was exposed to neuroethics, I thought it was fascinating, but I didn't know how to apply it to my company. And I remember being invited to Korea to the International Brain Initiative, kind of neuroethics global summit. And it was so impressive, as Rachel was mentioning, how the cultural differences were very apart, from the brain research projects in Korea, in Japan, in the US, in Europe, and so on and so forth. But to summarize, I got a lot of inspiration from the guidelines of brain research, and I did write a paper myself to try to come down with specific questions that I could maybe bring into my own hardware or software or clinical development process. So it is not perfect, and I know there is some efforts in the industry to try to develop those guidelines, but to me, going step by step by the requirement that the brain research projects had to comply with neuroethics was a super useful exercise. And as Ben was saying, it has to do with a lot of how you inform the patient, it's like a set of kind of questions, right, that you have to go after. So that was very useful. In terms of the conflict with investors, I'm very fortunate to have amazing Boston-based investors, and I did raise a significant Series A year ago. But I also think that the fact that most of my investment is going to clinical trials under the FDA, it also puts a lot of these ethical questions into the patient and all the clinical trials execution, right? So we are really driven to approval of these new therapies. And I think there are blind spots in the FDA process, but I don't think there is misalignment right now in the investors and the FDA process and the ethical issues. So I'm sure there are things that will be debatable. And as Rachel was saying, or Ben, maybe there are things that will come, 5 or 10 years from now that we couldn't anticipate. But on the bright side, when you see, DBS or what Medtronic has achieved with many patients suffering from Parkinson's, or what we can do non-invasive to deal with brain diseases, if you see the huge need in mental health, in neurodegeneration, and the amazing opportunity for entrepreneurs and new technologies to deal with the brain, I'm always optimistic. I know there are challenges, but the benefits for patients, if you do it right, are just amazing. So I will keep on fighting hard to do our best, but I think the opportunity to help patients is gigantic.
Yeah, I totally agree with Anna. And if the medical space has holes, the consumer space, which is where we operate, is a black hole. It is truly the Wild West in terms of ethics and regulation. And I'll give a boring answer and then the fun, entertaining one that's also a little bit of a case study. So the boring one is with two of my colleagues who are actually in the audience, Dr. Villariani and Dr. Stanley. We're co-authoring a chapter of a book on neuroethics, and we're actually the only company that's writing a chapter. Everyone else is an academic from a lab around the world, and what our submission on is mapping the role of various stakeholders. So what is the push or pull from investors or a board or customers or the media? All of these different groups have a different incentive in push decision-making relative to the organization in a different way. So if you can map that trail of influence, you can essentially see how an organization makes decisions. And if a government entity or some other agency has policies put in place, that's another stakeholder, that's another set of influence. So that's the boring answer. The fun answer is I want to talk about a case study of Neurable when we initially had tried to commercialize neurotechnology into virtual reality, especially when it was really, really exciting in 2016. And we created an amazing technology, an awesome demo, a game which we demoed right here in 2017, that we got the cover of the New York Times for, a game you can control with your mind. So awesome technology, but struggled with the product market fit. We had to go back to the drawing table and see where were people paying for neurotechnology and how could our capabilities help solve a problem. And in doing a whole bunch of interviews, I went to, I can't tell you how many different conferences and changing ideas and business models, we finally got a contract with a very large check size. And that was from consumer packaged goods. It was to do neuromarketing. We were offered a lot of money, which, as I can tell you, a venture-backed startup is a very important thing to have to bring to your investors. We finally had a check in front of us for a non-insignificant sum of money. And my co-founder and I and my team, we had a series of conversations, and ultimately we turned it down. And that comes down to mapping the various stakeholders, mapping the various influences. It wasn't in my company's culture to sell data for profit. It was in my company's culture to only work on applications that take advantage of people, in my humble opinion, as opposed to helping people. And there's also a very practical consideration where if we wanted to create this technology that could change the world, it needs to be with a brand and an initiative that people trust and want to encourage, as opposed to a brand or initiative that people might actually fear or worse, are ignorant and unaware of. So that's the first real like crazy ethical crossroads that my company had to face, and I'm very proud and supportive of investors that helped us navigate that difficult decision. And the other like funny story was just several months ago, I got a cold email from a very, very, very large tobacco company that you all know, and they're like, "We will pay you if you can show that our products are calming." And I'm like, wow, y'all are evil. And again, like as a company that literally needs to show revenue in order to grow, a company that has employees and their families to think of, because in a startup you grow closer than you would in a large organization. Like my employees have started to have kids and make families. So as a co-founder, you're looking out for their well-being. So saying no to money is hard, and it's somewhat of an ethical thin line where do I make the ethical decision to my team, or do I make the ethical decision to humanity or whatever larger humanitarian initiative you're embarking on. But I think especially for a small company that's stripped of resources and having to make hard decisions every day, neuroethics is a very interesting topic, and the way to address that and to say whether they're at odds or not, I think are the influences at odds.
Thank you for that. And I should say both, I want to commend both Adam and Anna. I think you two are two of the few people who have actually written about neuroethics, right? Actually done the work to write and publish in the space. Adam, I may or may not have been one of the reviewers for your chapter on neuroethics. But, I really want to commend that. And I want to encourage other people in the audience, if anybody is an entrepreneur working in this space, to really, get involved and think about the ethical issues. I want to circle back to a conversation we started on one of the opening questions, which was about responsibility, identity, impacts to autonomy, and agency. Big questions, right? And I'll throw this one to anyone on the panel who wants to respond, right? But one question is, do we think these are real? I think at least some of us on the panel think these are real issues and real concerns to be grappling with. But thinking about practical steps that we can take to anticipate and address these issues, what should we be doing? Like, is there anything that neurotechnology developers or researchers or physicians, right? Is there anything we can do to anticipate and potentially mitigate some of these questions?
So when I turn on my DBS, as I just did right now, I always get like a small burst of joy. Now, I do know as well, just from experimenting with my own doctor back in Toronto, if I turn up too high too quickly, I can quickly become very manic. What that means for me, I get labeled as being a manic individual in those circumstances, but that's because psychiatry still has a way to go, I think, in really getting down to the individual and seeing what's happening at the individual basis. What I mean by that is, like, I would explain myself in those moments as feeling like a child. All of my senses also feel heightened. Now, I don't know why that is. It could be just because of like the neurophysiological response from being able to move properly again, or it could be something happening, deep in my brain. But I do feel like a child in those moments. And everything tastes better, as you might be able to see. Everything feels better. The drinks, every single thing, all of my senses feel heightened. And actually, there's somebody here in the audience. I don't know if he wants to talk right now, but I'll give him the chance right now. His name is Felik. I don't know if Felik is here somewhere. Do you want to speak now? Is now a good time for you to come
we
up?
actually have the table afterwards with the patient engagement perspective.
Sure, but there's one question I'd love to ask him that might be relevant, I think, to this whole discussion about identity in particular. Because I can't say that I feel like the same person that I was beforehand, before I did this DBS surgery. And I'd like to ask Felik, because Felik has been there through my entire journey. He saw me, he's known me my whole life, he's my uncle. I'm staying in his house right now in Brookline. And I wanted to ask him if he could give me his perspective right now, in front of everybody here, on how my identity or personality may have changed over the course of getting this DBS implanted deep inside of me. And then maybe give him some time just to reflect on how he felt watching his nephew go through this whole procedure as well. So yeah, Felix, the floor is yours.
Two comments first. I think I was shocked to hear that Adam just related to the ethics of the kind of, let's say, very significant intervention into the human body as a data problem only, and equating the problem in the same way as how do we deal with the data like on TikTok or Facebook. I mean, let's consider what we are really doing here, okay? That's very frequently that's irreversible intervention into the human body, okay? And we really don't even know what will happen tomorrow. We may know what happens today with, and we don't really know what happens tomorrow. One, I think it was Ben and you mentioned a very critical element here, namely advocating for a patient consent to be a living document, okay? Especially from my perspective, watching the experience that Ben had for the last year, I think that is critically important. The reaction of the patients, okay, keep changing. The reaction of the family or the people around the patient also keep changing. Okay? It is not constant, it's not steady. It's a very dynamic process that needs to be readjusted and adjusted continuously. Let me go back to the question that kind of Ben addressed. Well, what you see, what he demonstrated, and we have seen all of on the screen, the DBS in his case has a profound impact on his physical well-being. Okay? The dystonia, the tremors, and so on, even the way you speak can be affected. What is not visible, that also his behavior is affected as well. And we really don't understand it very well. Sometimes more, sometimes less. Sometimes he's happy, sometimes he's less happy. Sometimes he's very agitated, sometimes his filters are less, kind of, let's call them social filters, and sometimes they are they don't seem to be changing. Okay? And we really don't know how to deal with it. Okay? They create a number of profound ethical questions. How do you deal with all of this? Okay? We really don't know. We don't even have a good language. We don't have vocabulary to address it very well. Okay? But the people that are looking into this, especially from the ethics point of view, I think have to involve patients. Okay? He is one of very few in this field that is looking at the issue of kind of a neurointervention, okay, from the patient point of view, from the subject point of view. Everybody else is looking at it from the different point of view, treating the patient, researching the therapy. But I think that has to be a very dynamic and very involved kind of input from the patients that are affected. I don't know if this helps.
Thank you for that. And again, I think we've heard this from both you, Ben, and your uncle, that there really needs to be more patient involvement throughout this process. And I would say from my perspective, there's at least now starting to be more recognition, broader recognition that this is a major issue, I think.
Anna?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and one comment, because you're aware, I mean, Ben, one issue is, for example, when we started at Boston Children's, our epilepsy trial, I remember that, I don't know how, one of the patients in the study found my cell phone as a sponsor, right? Which I don't know how they did. But they called me and I totally remember this patient. She was a nurse in one of the hospitals in the Boston area and had a remarkable improvement in seizure reduction. And she called me and say, can I buy your device? And I say, no, you are on a clinical trial with the FDA. I'm super sorry. We need to wait until this therapy is approved by the FDA. And then I remember she said, okay, I've seen that online on Amazon, there are some transcranial current stimulation devices that I can buy. And so if you don't sell me yours, I'll go on Amazon. And I remember I'm bringing this up as an ethical debate because I remember with Anna in some conversations, we found out that in Reddit, there were 11,000 people doing brain stimulation to themselves. And today, I don't know how many, right? So I don't think we can look the other way, on how ethically we can help patients that are in need, whilst the technologies are being developed. And that's, to me, a very strong ethical issue. So I don't know whether Rachel or Ben or Anna had any questions. Non-invasive is much easier to access other technologies than invasive, right? But this is happening today.
Yeah, there's actually one thing I want to say. So I assume, Anna, at the end of your trial that the patient had to give her device back, and she wanted to keep it. But there's actually something that I find quite alarming that's happening in the DBS clinical trials, which is that...
Which clinical trial? The
DBS.
Brain stimulation.
The deep brain stimulation trials, like what Ben has, is that at the end of the trials, sometimes because the trial is finished, they take it out. And so sometimes the patients have had a remarkable response, and then suddenly the trial is over, and sometimes the trial has been completed. Other times, the device company has just decided it's not a lucrative strategy, and they want to invest elsewhere. And so they're stopping a trial early for patients who've had positive effect, and then taking the device out of that patient's brain. Then there's a lot of other permutations of things that can happen. It can be very hard to recruit for these trials, and so maybe they don't get enough patients enrolled. Maybe they don't get enough patients enrolled that they get the statistical significance to improve that it has highest level of efficacy that they need to get past the FDA threshold. So maybe if it's a trial of 10 people and Ben and someone else has a miraculous response, but they don't have a high enough number, so then the FDA doesn't pass it and the devices get removed. So obviously, with Anna's device that's external, that's really disappointing and frustrating to the patients. But if you imagine that if you were Ben and the machine that had changed your life got removed from your brain, that could be quite traumatic and feel quite unfair.
No, I just want to say, I might go out and I don't know what I would do in that situation per se, but it wouldn't be good. I can tell you that much.
Ben, just speaking about informed consent and these post-trial responsibilities, right? Like what happens after the trial ends? Do you recall speaking to your researchers about that? What did they tell you about what's going to happen after the trial that you're in is over?
So in many ways, I'm a special case, but one of the easiest ways for me to explain is that I have a very close relationship with all of my doctors as well, and my whole clinical team. They basically are on standby for me. Now that puts them in some ethical quandaries, it puts me in some ethical quandaries, but that's the relationship that I have with my team, is that we're very, very close with one another. And I think that in DBS in particular, your programmer and the person who implants it, the person who deals with you day to day, they have to be very close to you. So I know he would fight for me. I have no doubt about that. Back to Medtronic as well. I don't think that I'm in danger in any way of them removing anything from my brain. But I get how in most patients out there, they wouldn't have that option for them. And most patients, they don't have that relationship with their doctor either. And yet it's been so critical for me at every stage that I have a close personal relationship with my neurologist and programmer, because they have very literal control over who I am and what I am. Which is a whole other topic that I don't know if we have time to get into now, but having that, every patient must have somebody who they have to be like your best friend. There has to be somebody who really gets who you are and what you are and everything about your personality and everything that goes into what it means to be a human being if they're going to be your programmer. And they have to be willing to fight for you not for this device manufacturer, not for anybody else. They have to be on your side, no matter what happens. So I wouldn't have gone through this trial if I didn't have that relationship with my doctor.
Well, I was just going to ask, like, why do you think that is? Why are you special or got this kind of treatment, whereas other people might not?
Well, one is just my standing in the community. I'm a very vocal advocate. I champion for myself like the whole way through, and I champion for others as well. I think really that is the main reason why I'm getting so much special treatment, is because of that simple fact that I'm a very vocal person in this community. I'm like a leader in the community, and that, well, yeah, that's basically it.
I think obviously having a committed physician, as a physician, I believe to be hugely important to patients' outcomes. But there's also a whole infrastructure that's beyond the control of the physician, right? So if it's a small trial, they don't enroll enough patients to get statistical significance to get passed by the FDA. So then you have a non-approved device in someone's brain. And then the insurance companies are going to say, this was never approved by the FDA. I'm not paying for this. So say a line gets infected. Every day in the ICU is $20,000. And an insurance company is going to say, why am I paying to maintain a device that doesn't have FDA approval, right? And so maybe you have a beloved neurosurgeon who's like, okay, I'll do the case, but operating room costs easily $100,000. And so who is covering all of these costs? The clinical trial sponsors who have, felt like it was a flop and are not interested in investing any more money, and what's their obligation? What if that company has already gone under? So people are left in these situations where no one's clearly responsible for these devices. And I'm sorry, I think I'm the naysayer here, but to me, the lobotomy wasn't that long ago. And so when we start to think about doing these deeply invasive things to people's brains, what is our responsibility to that human being in the future and the potential repercussions?
Another good reason, though, to move to Canada, where we don't have some of these same healthcare problems.
Yeah, and imagine all the trouble we are going through in this discussion, and we are mostly talking medical. So let's, just to provoke the audience, what about the we're thinking consumer? What about if companies like Neuralink or implanted devices are used for brain-computer interaction or communication, right? That's a whole different ballgame, right? Implanted devices for communication. So I think it's, I don't know how the panel feels about, these implanted devices or non-implanted for consumer or communication applications, and whether the audience today would feel that this should be reflected as a neuro right, as some people are claiming, as a constitutional right to defend the autonomy and identity of your brain, which defines you as human or not. So I'm just throwing, that provocation into the panel and the audience, of course.
And I was going to say, I know that Neuralink's going to get brought up tonight. I am shocked that it came from you and not the audience. First of all, we should recognize that we are very medically top-heavy right now. That there's a whole consumer perspective, non-invasive, but especially non-invasive, but also invasive, that we're not necessarily giving a lot of light to. And I think that there's not something that's necessarily better or worse. I think they're just different. I think if you think about two different vertical reach versus intensity of problem, that's a loose way to characterize medical versus consumer applications. But there are a whole bunch of ramifications. Like, we still don't understand the implications of giving your data to 23andMe or having systems that are tracking your accelerometer on a daily basis. We don't know if that information is going to be sold to insurance companies to make it so that if you're predisposed to disease, they're going to increase your rate. So, I think that neuroethics or data ethics, whatever ethics you want to talk about, should be considered holistically, both medically, where a lot of this comes from, especially because it is a very academic field, but even more so to consumer, where it's not so commonplace.
And so I'll draw this back to some of the questions that you guys submitted as part of the audience related to enhancement technology. So, there's a lot of investment now in consumer devices that are currently marketed for enhancement or will be marketed for enhancement in the future, right? And a lot of you in the audience raise questions about inequalities, right? So how are these technologies, if they are successful, right? That's an assumption here, right? If they do work to enhance ourselves, right? Are they just going to exacerbate current inequalities that we have? And we all know that we have a lot of them in this country and in this world. And is there anything that we should be doing? Maybe entrepreneurs can speak to this, or I would say anybody else on this panel, right? To think about this and to try to consider strategies, right, to mitigate this possibility.
Go ahead.
So I have a lot of feelings about this. And other than ethics, I'm the director of young adult mental health. And 90% of young adults with first episode psychosis do not have access to evidence-based treatment. I have students from MIT who are on my wait list, untreated for many, many, many months. Some of them have dropped out of school while they're waiting to see me. We have kids die on our wait list of suicide. And so to me, it makes me feel a little bit crazy when I hear about these $100 million trials, when we have kids with first episode psychosis who don't have access to a 5-cent pill that could help treat their disease. The day when someone that is diagnosed with psychosis, their life expectancy decreases by 15 years. And so we're allowing these kids to die of mania and psychosis while we're spending enormous amounts of money on what I find to be, technologies that are decades and decades away. And the counter argument that people in my field would give is that we need to be looking to the horizon because our current treatments suck, which there is some truth to the fact that our current treatments suck, but we're not even offering what we do have. And you know what else works really well for schizophrenia is like vocational rehab, where you take them to Walmart and help them fill out a job application. Or like maybe a social skills group where they start to talk to other people who are recovering from psychosis. Or just helping them re-enroll back in classes, which is actually, MIT has like the best mental health support of any of our colleges. So they have the opportunity to do that, but at most colleges they don't. So for me, the question of resource distribution is very intense because I see it every single day, and sometimes it feels like the funding that's being siphoned off for novel technology is being redistributed from patients who are in desperate need today.
I think the concept of resource allocation really hits at the heart of access, democratic capabilities of neurotechnology. I want to give a lot of credit to my co-founder who instilled with me this, who's in the audience, Dr. Ramsey Zalkade, he's awesome, who instilled in me his vision of this world without limitations. And that's an idea that whether you're neurodiverse or whatever, normally abled, there is a way to equalize, and we should continuously try to find those ways. So one of the ways that Neurobuild tries to do this is we try to make technology ubiquitous and easily accessible. Now, there are definitely ethical ramifications. There are questions around, will this exacerbate greater inequity between developing nations and developed nations where this technology will be made available first? But I can't speak to those outcomes right now, but I can speak to a very real example that happened last week where we were talking about a potential deal with a very large company that might make our product more expensive. And one of our scientists, he goes, Adam, isn't the point of this to make our technology more accessible? And he's absolutely right. And that led to a very real and helpful conversation about how we can increase access to these types of technologies, try to make this resource distribution a little bit more efficient and at least a little bit more fair. And I think within your relevant field, whether it's medical or consumer, you have a responsibility to try to push the agenda.
Yeah. Well said. I'll just add, so I was born in Nairobi, Kenya, and then when I was 3 years old, my parents made a decision about where they wanted to live. They happened to choose Toronto because my uncle was also living, not this uncle, but a different uncle. He was also living in Toronto at the time. So they said, okay, we'll go move to Toronto. Toronto also happens to be the world's center for DBS. They didn't know that at the time. They didn't know that 30 years later, their son was going to need deep brain stimulation therapy. But I'm very fortunate that they chose Toronto, but I'm also very cognizant of the fact that back in Nairobi, Kenya, let's say they had chosen to stay there, they don't even have levodopa. most of sub-Saharan Africa, they can't even access the basic medication that to me, it cost me 25 cents for one pill. And they can't get that in most parts of the world. And that kind of inequality is something that I think we all have to be very cognizant of. But, I mean, at the end of the day, this technology that I have in my brain, yes, it will exacerbate inequality. Yes, I'm very aware of like how fortunate I am and that how unfair it is for me to be the one that was chosen, whatever you want to say there, to get this particular therapy. But it is what it is. I mean, but as a patient advocate, something that I'm going to be spending the rest of my life doing is trying to make sure that companies like Medtronic, Boston Scientific, and Merck, the makers of levodopa, that they spread this to as many people as possible and they make it as affordable as possible and that they make it as equitable as humanly possible. There's only so much that they can do, there's only so much that this community can do, but there's a lot that we could be doing to push forward and make these things more equitable.
Better is good.
All right.
Yeah, I think that on the human enhancement side, I don't know, Anna, if you were in that workshop that we had on human enhancement years ago at the National Institute of Science. And I am more with Rachel. I'm less optimistic about the pure human enhancement technologies. I think my guess is it will not in principle be used to solve inequality, but probably the smart and the richest will try to become smarter and richer. So, and we did debate with a bunch of scientists and people in that room. And I don't know, I think at the end, there will have to be some regulation around that because especially in the non-invasive side, I think it's going to create a lot of ethical issues. And there are already companies, there's a company in the Silicon Valley who has a patch for memory enhancement. I know there's a company now in Israel doing brain stimulation for learning. So, you know, you can accelerate your learning process and learn faster, right? You can improve your memory, right? So little by little, there will be more and more of this, right? So, but the question is how affordable and how spread are they going to be and whether somebody's going to have to step in and regulate or not.
All right, I have one last final question for the panelists. This has been fantastic. And then actually we're gonna have time for Q&A. So if you guys have any questions, get the questions ready and we will be circulating microphones, I believe. So somebody will be doing that? Yeah, okay. And so the question I have for the panelists, and we're gonna go in reverse order here, is what is one key question or concern that you have for the future of neurotechnology? And I don't know, Anna, if you have an answer, we'll go with you first.
I mean, given what we know about the brain, in my field, which is the medical field, I am still puzzled on how we can personalize these therapies in a way that they really help patients and what are the long-term effects of these therapies, especially the novel ones, right? So I think that those two questions, you know, until what point of personalization we can push the envelope. In our case, we are developing these neurotwins or digital copies of your brain in the cloud, biophysical and electrophysiological copies of your brain to really try to simulate how the brain works electrically and how it will respond to a certain brain stimulation paradigm. But it's so hard. I mean, it's really hard to crack. So I think those are the two things that really, I'm really more worried about long term.
So mine is something that I think Rachel actually started with, about identity and something my uncle spoke to as well. But it really comes down to one question for me specifically about what am I? Because obviously I'm still somewhat human, but there's a part of me that is very much not human anymore. So I don't really know that anyone has a good answer for me about my own identity at this point. But it's something that maybe I can throw out to the audience or to my fellow panelists about what am I right now? Am I, yeah.
I'll
Yeah, take that one.
My big question is somewhat to what end? That some of the biggest companies, both very quietly and very loudly working on neurotechnology, are public companies. primarily driven by ad revenue. And they have somewhat of a responsibility to their shareholders for profit. So especially when we start to have interfaces like augmented reality where companies will have access to introduce stimulus artificially to us at all times, to what extent can you take advantage of neurochemical cycles? Like I think we already see it with social media. And I can only imagine how much worse it could get when you had direct information from the brain labeled against an advertisement, labeled against where you are and all of your demographic information. So like to what end? And that's where I think neuroethics has a very large role to play, and we have a responsibility to address that.
I think my question kind of rhymes with Ben about both identity and responsibility for behavior. So when do we decide identity begins and ends? And after that shift, who's then responsible? And when and if the machines become responsible, and what we do to manage that.
Great. These are all really great answers.
What about you, Anna?
What about me? What is one key question or concern? Well, I would say something I've been thinking a lot about recently is how to distinguish, all the hype and the hope from the reality, because there's a lot of, loud voices out there on Twitter that have a lot of followers that may hype up certain, not just Elon Musk, but other people too, but primarily Elon Musk, right? That hype up neurotechnology. And do so in a way that I think is potentially misleading to patients and to people who are really suffering and people who are vulnerable. And so to me, I don't see, all that hype going away. So for me, one of the questions is how do we navigate this, right? I think hype, especially when it comes to thinking about how to improve people's medical conditions. I think it's it's different from just hyping up a non-invasive enhancement technology that maybe will help with something. When you're talking about people who are really disabled, hype for me feels like a more serious ethical issue.
Remember the lobotomy.
There you go. And with that, we can go to Q&A. So I'd love to hear additional questions from the audience. We have the microphone circulating. I see some hands.
So neuroethics and I think traditional bioethics have traditionally been really obsessed with concepts like consent, identity, philosophy of mind. I'm wondering what if there is anything to learn from disability studies, what it means to be cognitively normal, neurotypical, as well as history of science about, Professor Conrad, you were talking about lobotomy wasn't that long ago. So I was wondering what you think in neuroethics, if there is anything to learn from these different not traditionally ethics topics.
So first, can we get these blinding lights off of us? Maybe shine them onto the audience a bit so I can see who's talking. And can you quickly introduce yourself as well?
Oh yeah, sorry, I'm Justin. I'm an undergraduate from Harvard studying neuroscience and philosophy.
Take my class.
Is that ethical?
Coercion for educational purposes. I think we can talk about that. So I think you brought up many interesting points there. Among that, I heard neurodiversity, and I think there's a lot of questions about, what is psychiatric or neurological illness, right? I think we can just all be honest that the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which is how we manage all of mental health and psychiatry, is basically useless. And so all of our diagnoses are a line in the sand, right? Every time I evaluate a patient, I ask them a bunch of questions, then I'm well, are these symptoms really bothering you? That's question number one. And then question number two is well, are they getting in the way of work or friends or other important things in your life? And so, it's a very arbitrary judgment. So I think that that's also another question that we can say, if we're talking about the spectrum from illness, I think we could all say, like, we can see Ben's illness and we would call that an illness. There are lots of other illnesses that we can't see. And then there's also an arbitrary line in the sand about where is illness and where is enhancement. I could give you like 100 examples of this, but I'll try to hold back. But there's also a lot of questions. If we start to eliminate certain behaviors or characteristics and types of people, like what we're going to lose when we try to like homogenize ourselves neuropsychiatrically. So I don't know if that answered any of your questions, but we'll have a whole semester to talk about it.
Thank you.
I'll actually throw in a very quick response to that. So I think I just want to touch upon the history and the disability studies there. So Anna mentioned the do-it-yourself brain stimulation movement, which I actually did my PhD on right across the street over here at MIT. And one of the things I did was actually look to history, and it turns out that people were actually stimulating not just their brains, but parts of their body. They were actually using home electrical stimulation devices 100 years ago, like between 1880, like 1910. It was a really popular thing to do, right? So I think history can teach us about parallel situations. I think there's a lot we can learn from history. Science, technology, and society studies also has a lot to offer neuroethics. Disability studies and thinking about situated perspectives, like who are the people writing about neuroethics, what perspectives are they bringing, and what perspectives are they leaving out? And especially that comes back to the patient conversation here, right? Who's not being included at the table? And so I think disability studies have, really, at least in part, shed a light. That's something that's really considered, like context and situatedness. And so I think, that can really lend, that neuroethics could really benefit from that. Other questions? Yeah.
I think I have the microphone over here. Sorry. Hi, Bob Pryor, MIT Press. Ben used the word programmer when he was describing part of the team of people that's been working with him. And I think the word programmer has perhaps two meanings here. Also, when you're talking about informed consent, he has to be informed, but are the people who are involved with Ben on the clinical side also signing some sort of form? Is there awareness there? The word programmer, I assume Ben, you meant is somebody who's literally programming the device. But that person could also be programming your behavior.
So, yes, they inevitably are doing both. And I'm not sure who you meant by my clinical team, but like my uncle, for instance, who's back there again, should he have signed that informed consent process? Should he have been involved? I think maybe so. Especially my parents, so like both my parents would have, I think, should have been much more integral to that informed consent process. I think that's part of what you were getting at, but I'm not exactly sure.
I kind of heard about what are the duties that the clinicians have to the patient. I think the example I gave about trials ending and machines that were therapeutic getting taken out is kind of an example. And I think, Ben kind of talked about his personal experience with the clinicians. Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the biggest issues that I'm concerned about. Where does the therapeutic relationship versus the research relationship exist? And the research relationship is supposed to be based on neutrality. So a researcher is supposed to put something in your brain and have no feelings about whether or not it helps you. That's like the core of research. But a clinical relationship is obviously someone who wants to help a patient. And so how do we navigate those relationships? And what happens to those relationships once the clinical trial is over? I teach ethics, so I don't give any answers, but I just ask more questions.
I think one of the things that Rachel, you did a good job of highlighting when it comes to the post-trial responsibilities is how many stakeholders there are at play, right? There's like how many people, right? You have the companies, you have the funders, you have the investors, right? Funders can be private investment, you can have government investment in the trials, right? The patients, the research coordinators, the companies manufacturing the product, the programmers, the patient reps, the neurosurgeons, right? There's a whole constellation of different people that are involved in any, that have some stake or play some part in any kind of clinical trial, right? And figuring out what those responsibilities are, right, for each of those stakeholders to the research participant is really, it's a really tricky question. It's really complicated.
And one other one that So one other thing that is very important to anybody's care is like people around you. So as I was just talking about my uncle again and my parents, without them, I wouldn't be here today. Without them, I wouldn't have gone through this procedure. So they also need to be, in many ways, they're, I think, should be elevated to be the most important part of the people that are around me and around any patient, really. Because I can tell you guys all about, if you want, like how arduous this process was, but it was very difficult. It took a very long time as well. And I know that without them, I wouldn't be able to be here. So yeah, they also need to be part of whatever we're talking about right now.
Absolutely, yeah.
Hello, hi, my name is Ariel. I'm a first-year computational neuroscience grad student at Boston University. And you may have touched upon this question in some of your ending remarks, but as we were talking about informed consent and the possible limits that you can have on informing a potential patient, so considering the possible changes that like neurotech can have on a person or your identity, and these obstacles that could be presented because of that, and the huge implications that follow those, do you think that there are particular areas in neurotech, like in devices or therapies, that we may actually never be able to ethically implement within like this foreseeable future?
Yes.
Oh yeah, definitely. I can give one quick example. I hope it's okay with Adam if I talk about this, but earlier today, did a little experiment in his office as well. And I think the implications of what we even did like very briefly today might be very profound in the future. But there's obviously no clinician there, there's no ethical framework that anybody there adhered to. And yet, I think what we did might one day hopefully help other patients like myself. So there are times in which, maybe I'm going to try and flip the question a bit, but there are times in which I think more leeway should be given to people to just go and do things as well, without some of these ethical guidelines in place. I'm not saying, obviously, like, if it's a clinical setting, yes, we need these ethical boundaries there. But there are also instances where it's okay, in some sense, just go off and try something without having to sign like a 100-page document saying whatever the hell was in there.
I think the ethical guidelines are super important. I think it's having overbearing policy that can inhibit things, and usually there's a trade-off for it, but sometimes it can just be for legal sake or for protection's sake. For example, I don't know if I should be saying this, but I will anyways. At Neuroble, we do a lot of experiments. I work with the Air Force, and what takes them 1 year plus in terms of data collection is what Neuroble does in 1 week. We've done 45 different experiments in a span of about 6 months, and it would not be possible to get IRB approval for every one experiment. For if we're running a task, we have to change a color or change a computer monitor or some variable that is technically would be a requirement if we were going through IRB approval every time, but is overbearing, especially for a small company with limited resources. So I think our platform, our perspective has been, how do we responsibly make decisions to the best of our ability? And honestly, this is like the bottom line of startups, is how do we manage and mitigate risk to the maximum extent possible?
I guess to your question, I don't know if you still have the mic, but is it about research methods, or is it about like developing technology, or about the implementation of technology, or just an umbrella of all of those?
Well, I think it's more about just like developing technologies. Like, are there certain boundaries that ethically, we'd be unable to solve? We were talking about enhancement as well. Are there certain things that cannot ethically be implemented within humans, because we're talking about, if we're going off to do research, we're doing them in people, and so that will always have implications, ethical implications. So that's what I'm wondering.
I think that there's a question about when and if we use these technologies involuntarily. So I'm a psychiatrist. I have involuntarily treated many, many, many patients. I have given medications to patients involuntarily that have, one patient almost died from a medication that I gave them. So we do this a lot. And so there's always a calculus when we involuntarily treat someone that we could hurt them. And I've involuntarily given people ECT, which is a very old treatment that you may have seen horrified in Hollywood. It's actually very, very boring, but it is involved in giving people seizures. And so we use a lot of neurotechnologies and involuntary methods, but one of the indications that they're seeking for Ben's treatment, deep brain stimulation, is for depression. So should we be able to put someone through neurosurgery involuntarily to treat their depression? And then, as Adam mentioned, there's a lot of interest amongst the military for how these could be enhancing. And so should the military be able to mandate people to use these types of enhancements to improve their performance?
And Anna, were you about to say something?
Yeah, I think that one thing that also we haven't brought a lot is, okay, we talk about the patient, but about the physician. A couple of weeks ago, there was a neurosurgeons congress, and I had a table dinner, plenty of neurosurgeons that usually do DBS and surgery in patients with epilepsy. And I asked the table, where would you use my technology, which is non-invasive and can reduce seizures? And half of the table said before surgery, definitely. And half of the table say no way before surgery, after surgery, only for those who fail. So that doesn't have to do with the inclusion and exclusion criteria. So, the other reflection is, how do you bring the physician, how are the ethical decisions, and Rachel, you're a physician, right? But it really, I tend to think carefully, are they sending the patients to surgery because they make more money or because they can cure them?
Move to Canada.
So, exactly, go to Canada again.
Actually, the question made me think of something that you brought up in our conversations, our pre-planning meeting. We had little panel chats on Zoom, which is that you didn't know about some of the effects beforehand, right? Some of the effects of the DBS were unanticipated, and you could speak about that in a second. But I think one of the issues, right, is this unanticipated risks, right? When you're studying a totally new technology, especially a neurotechnology. Researchers often don't know, right, what the potential effects are going to be on personality, identity. Those are things that are not, researchers often look at things like adverse events, right, safety. They don't look at these broader things that are really harder to anticipate. So I think that's really one of the challenges that, how do you encompass that, these unanticipated risks?
You're asking. I have no idea. How do you predict because so much of this is unpredictable. So much of what I went through is unpredictable. So much of the whole process, just nobody could have known anything about. But then I think it comes back to what I started with, the informed consent. Because there were a few things that I think I could have known or understood better, or the people around me could have known and understood better. And I think they might have been better prepared for some of the challenges that came about. For example, I thought that the day of the surgery was going to be the worst day that I experienced. And it was very rough, don't get me wrong, but it was not the worst day of this procedure. That came the day after my first programming session when I became deathly ill for some unknown reason. And I think that my family could have been better prepared by my clinician if they were more part of the process. But there's a time constraint on everything that we're doing as well. We have to be very aware of. My doctor doesn't have any more time. He has 500 patients that are all under his care. He does the best job that he can with the time that he has, but his time is limited. And for those wondering about DBS in general, the biggest bottleneck is the surgeons. In Toronto, we have one of the best surgery teams in the world, and there's 3 people who do DBS. Each one can only do 2 a week. So I don't know how we solve for that either. Sorry to just throw more questions into the air, but there's just so much that needs to be addressed, and needs to be discussed, needs to be thought about as well. Maybe something direct-to-consumer might be able to help with some of those things, but...
I was going to say something a little bit more negative, which is I think we have to accept that nothing will ever be perfect. And as people, I said this somewhat cheekily to Rachel, that neuroethics is just trying to be a good person and doing your best to be intentional about the decisions that you make. And I said this before, I hear it all the time from my team that better is good. And I truly believe that if we follow that mantra, if we take that as a guiding influence, then that will ultimately lead to the best possible outcome. But the fact of the matter is there are people that are not going to be able to get treatment. There are going to be situations where technology is used how it wasn't originally intended. There is precedent that we can look at to help inform these decisions, and we should. But at the end of the day, I think it's how do we as people help keep ourselves accountable and move ourselves in a positive direction.
Woo! Stop it. Question over here.
Hi, I'm Dr. Ramsey Alcade. I'm actually the CEO of NeuroTechX. Adam is one of my co-founders. And yesterday I was having a conversation with a company that does Alzheimer's research, and one of the big issues that happened was they were talking about how by the time we're able to diagnose these conditions, people have already gone through neurodegeneration for over 10 years. Today we had an incredible opportunity to have Ben, who's a friend of the company, come by. And I know you touched on it a little bit, but we were able to see how the Neurable technology was able to basically detect how the system he was using was affecting the brain. And I know we had some really incredible conversations about the implications, and I'd like for you both to highlight some of those implications and what early diagnosis could mean, and then the ethics tied to that.
So at the moment, it would be very difficult to get an early diagnosis of Parkinson's because there's no therapies that can slow down the progression of this disease. However, we do know there's more mounting evidence that exercise is basically the only disease-modifying therapy that we have. And getting people into physiotherapists at an earlier stage would do wonders for them. So yeah, I think that is my answer. But I mean, early detection is something that so at Rune Labs, I think I can say this, hopefully my CEO doesn't get too angry, but soon, we just signed an agreement with Apple that's gonna allow us to now monitor symptoms of Parkinson's disease. But what do we do? Because there's I think there's 50 million people around the world who have an Apple Watch. 0.1% of those that are over 55 are gonna have some sign of Parkinson's disease basically today. How do we tell people that you have this disease suddenly? Or should we be informing them that, yes, this is something that you might have, and these are maybe some steps that you can do, but sorry, there's nothing we can really do about this right now. However, when it comes to clinical trials, that's a whole different story, because then that should be our avenue for recruiting patients into clinical trials. I mean, every single trial, most of the drugs that we have that are in development, the earlier the better, the earlier we'll get a sign if something is working or not. So I think that's my answer.
Yeah, there's so many different flavors of ethics in that one statement alone. So he is talking about ethics specifically in regards to the types of treatment, but theoretically, what if Apple wasn't a good organization or shareholders perverse the decision-making so that that data, instead of being given directly to the person from whom it is derived, which is the first tenet of good data ethics, what if that was instead sold to insurance companies so that you knew who was at risk for a more expensive rate in the future? There are all these, that's the ethical conundrum that I'm very nervous about, but I think the main point is that there are all of these different types of ethical quandaries, and how we navigate them ultimately comes to the decisions that we make as an individual, and how that ultimately permeates and influences our larger organizations.
I also want to provide a counterpoint to the early diagnosis argument. So I guess I want to poll the audience. If you had a potentially terminal, terrible disease that was untreatable and you would die in 20 years and there was nothing you could do, would you want to know today? What do we think? Is that a third? What would you guys estimate? Okay, but whatever it is, it's not 100% of people, right? And so if we're all sitting here and this agreement was signed yesterday and 3 of us got a notification on our watch that we had Parkinson's, would everybody appreciate that? It seems like 2/3 of the room would not appreciate that. So I guess I'm not sure that all data is good data or all data is welcomed.
And I don't actually think that's the conversation. I think what you just did is a great example of what is the conversation, which is agency and information. You ask the audience, do you want this? You got their consent. You ask them to opt into a certain way or another. If we were forcing these insights on people, totally unethical. Totally agree with that. But if we educate people to what is the value of this information, what are the implications, and people then intentionally choose to make that decision, I think that's the most ethical decision you can make. Enough. I have a lot of friends here.
I will throw one counterpoint to your counterpoint, which is, I think this is coming sooner than we think. Yeah, well, yeah, sure. I mean, with digital, it's like being called digital phenotyping, right? So what are all these tracking, all these sensors, right? They are going to be able, most likely, to be able to diagnose things, right? So I think the point about opting in is important, but it does worry me slightly that companies will know without my knowledge, potentially, based on gathering sensor data from me, right, without me opting in. So they'll know, right? And maybe it's not a question of opting in, but they'll have that information without potentially my knowledge.
So rather than being told, you'll just start getting random advertisements.
Well, can you give an example of that?
Yeah, so right now people are looking at, right, whether Alexa can detect or, speech patterns that are indicative of early stage neurodegenerative disease or cognitive decline, right? I don't know. When is Amazon going to be able to do that? I don't know if they're going to tell me, right? So they might know before I know, and there'll be no, yeah.
In my opinion, I think they are not informing the end user on the implication of what could come from that technology, especially if they have the intent to commercialize the insight. Like, again, what's his name? Stephen Teal from Accenture, he published these 12 principles of data ethics. And the very first one is data should be used to directly benefit the person from whom the data is derived. And as you start to violate that principle, I think that illuminates what is unethical. So if you have this very lengthy legal document that no one ever reads and you're signing away your rights, like for example, there's a company called Alfonso that was acquired by one of the big TV companies, I forget. But basically they embedded a piece of code into a bunch of free smartphone games. And they're one of the ones responsible for listening to what's going on in your environment and then tagging it to the ads that you then see on your phone. Is that ethical? In my opinion, definitely not, even though you signed your rights away. I think if you knew that you were signing up for this, if you knew that there's this company that was intentionally trying to sell what's going on in your environment and you then opted in for it, that's something else. And probably you were then incentivized to make that kind of decision. But if you are, one, coerced into making the decision, like for example, a lot of people opt into social media settings that they might not actually want to, but they have to do it because if they don't, then they don't stay in touch with their social network. So, in my opinion, ethical decision-making is how do you empower the individual to make that trade-off without coercion, without surveillance, etc.
So Adam, to be controversial again, this last statement, when before you said ethics is about being a good person, I kind of don't share that because I think that
Please elaborate.
I think it's not up to the CEOs being a good or bad person. I think that as a society, right, and I think that's why these debates and the day of today is so important, we really have to put the focus on Ben, on the patient, on the individual, on what it means to be human, and don't leave it up to whether, the CEOs or the person are good or bad. So that's why I think that these guidelines, these measures, these protections should definitely be in place for neurotechnologies.
We have to wrap it up soon. So you can respond quickly. And then
My point is not for CEOs to be good people. Everyone should be a good person, and that should be unpacked. That means that you are advocating for what's right for you, that you are petitioning for what is deserved, and that it's not just I strongly recommend against the notion that it's the CEOs who control everything. It's truly not. Ask any CEO if they get to make the decisions they want to make, and they will tell you that is not the case.
All right, you have been waiting very patiently over there for your question. And so I think this is going to be the last question. I'm going to ask the panelists to respond briefly. And then I just want to say that for all of you who are waiting with your questions, this is not your last opportunity to talk to the panelists because we are going to be, well, first of all, you can go to the bar, which is open till 9:30. I want to make sure that people get time there. But after that, you can come back and the panelists are going to be at different stations. And actually, let's go to the question first and then I'll talk about the station. So.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So, hi, I'm Yasmin. I'm an undergraduate neurotech developer from Toronto, so hey, Canada. Yeah, my advice would be, what advice do you give to future neurotech developers? Because the future of neurotechnology seems to be intertwined with like research and medicine and now consumer electronics with Neurable. But the history is, neurotech was started from DARPA. Like, let's not move away from that point. So there's a lot of privatization with IP from these defense agencies that work with neurotech. So how do you see the future of neurotech developing, especially in terms of open source IP and just neuroethics effectively?
Map influence. Internet, I believe, was also a DARPA invention. So all of these technologies, I cannot emphasize this point strongly enough. Technology is neither good nor bad. It's how people wield them as tools. So the future of neurotechnology development or any technology development, whether it's going to be unethical or ethical, really comes down to the people that are making decisions about it. And if you're intentional about the decisions you make, if you choose to go to a company that you think may perverse that or not, you are giving your energy to whatever is the momentum going to drive a direction, whatever direction it's going. That didn't make sense. But you know what I mean.
So my advice is very simple. Involve patients early and often. At every single stage of any company, there should be a patient. Well, not really any, like anytime you're making a product for any group of individuals, those individuals must be part of the decision making at every single level that's humanly possible.
My advice is that you sit with your discomfort and you try to explore what is the nuance of the tension that you're feeling. And most of these questions, I think I kind of agree with Anna that it's beyond good and bad. Like, ethics begins once we're confused and we no longer know what's right or wrong. And you sit in the tension and you ask questions. We joke in my bioethics class that the answer, anytime anyone asks you a question, just respond with, it depends. And so that's where we all have to start, is answering every question with it depends, and then figuring out it depends on what.
Yeah, and I would say that it's a beautiful time for neurotech. I wouldn't worry about DARPA and the military, and so I think that was at the beginning. I see a lot of new neurotech companies coming into the field. I think it's a great area. We need smart people like the one in the room to help us deal with especially brain diseases and really get to this frontier. And as Rachel is saying, it's just make sure you are yourself, you ask yourself the difficult questions. And we don't have the answers for those, but use your gut feeling. I have a rule, and it's that, I really need to sleep tight and ask myself, challenge myself every day, right? So I think that you need to be very comfortable to wherever you go, and really be aligned with their values. And, you're going to devote so many hours of your life to a certain company or journey that I think that is what resonates with you internally, whether you're aligned. But ask always the very, very difficult questions.
That was a great way, with all those responses, that was a great way to wrap up the panel. So with that, I wanted to thank all our panelists for a really, truly informative and fascinating panel this evening. And special thanks too to Anna. It must be, is it 3 a.m. over you?
Yes, I might do a free dose of brain stimulation myself.
Yeah.
No, I'm joking.
I would not be that articulate at 3 a.m. or 1 a.m. So, thank you for staying up and for doing this with us. And thank you to everybody who submitted questions. Some really smart students out there. Wow, you really impressed me. Do you want to talk about the stations, or do you want me to? Yeah, so we're going to have a patient engagement station right there. That's going to be with Ben. So everyone can go get drinks, but then we're going to all be hanging out, and you could come chat with us further. So Ben is going to be in that general area.
So Ben will be in that general area, and we will have 2 other stations for the other panelists. So Rachel will be talking about neuroethics. If you have more specific questions to direct to her, she will be over here in the very center. Adam will be talking about entrepreneurship. If you have questions about neuroethics and entrepreneurship, he will be over here. So in 5 or 10 minutes, we'll give you guys a chance to just get another drink, some more food, go to the bathroom. We can all just disperse here, and if not, you're also welcome to just be out there and enjoy the rest of your night. And before I kind of hand this over, I just wanted to give the shout out to MIT AV, who has made this evening completely flawless. Thank you so much for Anna and making this happen, making this panel happen so fluidly. And the one final thing I wanted to address, we did have a few questions on Zoom from people, tuning in. And one of the questions had to do with hacking and the ethics so people there's the general public and they have questions about the possibility of hacking this kind of neurotechnology from or through companies like Neuralink, and the panelists here are welcome to answer that. As a technologist myself, the one thing I would strongly encourage for anybody who has very more technical questions about how to or the viability of hacking technologies is to come to NeuroTech Boston's Hack Nights, where we actually discuss the technical viability of being able to hack into things like this. And with
Please don't hack my brain.
We can talk about the possibility of doing that, because I think that's one of the fundamental questions: how possible, how viable that is. So with that,
can I just make one quick final plug? I just remembered there is, for everyone interested in neuroethics, there is an International Neuroethics Society where all we do is talk about neuroethics all the time. And so there's a conference coming up in November. The student rate is very cheap. It's going to be hybrid this year in Montreal and also virtual. So I just encourage you to check it out.
Very good. Okay, great. So in about 5 minutes or so, 5 to 10 minutes, feel free to take a break. We are going to disperse for our breakthrough sessions. But thank you again, all of you, for coming, and come prepared with your questions or your willingness to network. Thank you again.